Just start talking about your West Valley site. So let's start with the acquisition of the site. So you bought it from a UDOT auction. We'll plug in the video of you guys winning the auction. So walk me through that.
You bet. So August of 2020, UDOT brought, I can't remember exactly, but somewhere around 20 or 30 properties available to market. And they gave, I think, 30 or 45 days of notice for everybody to take a look at those. When we looked through the initial offering, John Taylor at the Legend Partners office in Salt Lake brought them to us and said, hey, you got to take a look at this. This screams retail. It screams retail pads. I think you should look at it. And I concurred. I like the area. I looked up the intersection of 56 West and 54 South. I went on Restaurant Trends to see what the fast food data looked like for the McDonald's that was located right there at the northwest corner of the intersection. The McDonald's there, my recollection is it was like a $4.5 million McDonald's. I went in and talked to the manager the next day, and he actually said it was over $5 million. And so that was really my indicator that it was an excellent fast food area. So most of what I started looking at immediately was who are the fast fooders that are not located in that trade area, and who can we go put there? Because it was such a strong fast food area that really became the opportunity. UDOT pushed it out August 2020. It was available, went through the process. They took bids. There was a call for offers date, and we bid and won it at the auction, which is an exciting time.
Nito, gang!
Closed it!
High five!
Right?
What's up,
That
man?
was closed.
What's up, John? Yes!
Oh,
it saved $125,000.
this item is closed.
Give me some context on you said McDonald's was 4.5 million and then it's 5. How do you compare like the revenues per McDonald's? How do you look at that to know it's a good site?
First thing I always do when I look at any new fast food opportunity is I just look up the top 50 QSR. QSR is a periodical, and they track all the quick service restaurants that have a drive-through in the nation. And you go there and you look for the last annualized data dump. So we're recording this in the end of July. So the 2023 data is not available yet. It'll be available next month in August. So right now, the best data we have is 2022 data from McDonald's. And what it's going to point in is going to show total sales for the chain, how many units they have, how many units they had the year prior. So you can see if a chain's growing or shrinking. And then they'll have an average unit volume. And they'll also provide the average unit volume in the US, which is gives you way more context. That's really what you're after. My recollection at the time was 2020, so we were looking at 2018 data. So McDonald's average unit volume was probably in the 2.7, 2.8 range. And historically, fast food does about 10 to 20% better in Utah than it does nationwide. So assume it's more like a $3 million, $3.2, $3.3 million average in the state.
So you're buying it, you just log on to like udot.com/auction or something. Well, and then you look at that site and you just start bidding. Does it have a minimum bid, or how does that part work?
Yeah. If you Google UDOT surplus properties, and you can do this with other DOTs as well that go through the auction process, they'll post all their properties. There's a way for you to register yourself so that you get notices so you can see everything that's coming through. They offer it pretty clean. You have a deed that's there. They've already pre-run the title report. You've got a survey for the property. So you have most of the information you need. And the reason why is the way their auction process works is you register as a bidder at the auction. And then you go through the auction process. And if you are the winner of the bid, you deposit 10% within, I can't remember, like 2 or 3 business days from winning the auction. And that 10% is non-refundable. It's applicable, but non-refundable day one. So you better like the property. If you're going to win the bid, you got to be committed to buying it.
And how did you get comfortable with such a short time window? Like, how much due diligence did you do beforehand?
So they set a minimum reserve offer. And so you kind of see the minimum. And usually if they don't hit that minimum, they won't sell it. Sometimes they'll come back to the top bidders that might be slightly below the minimum and try to work out a deal after the fact. But from a UDOT perspective, we got comfortable with a dirt price per foot that we were, had a comfort level with here, buying it speculatively. And we basically came up with the decision that if it went at or below that price, we would buy it. And if it was above that price, we would not buy it. And we attempted to detach emotion. Now, that being said, it would have been really entertaining if we would have gotten closer to where our price was. We were under what our price was.
Yeah. Okay. So how big was the site?
2 acres, right on the nose.
2 acres. And then were you like laying out sites before the auction, or was it just like, we know this corner, we like this corner, we know we can put something that works here? Or how did you think about that?
We didn't really have time to do that. Reason being is you only have about 30 days to really look at the property. So we started, initially trying to figure out who's who's this a hole for, right? So you start looking at car washes, or you start looking at burger stores, or you start looking at chicken or tacos or whichever, industry cluster you want to go with, and say, is it a hole for Taco Bell? Is it a hole for Del Taco? Is it a hole for Starbucks? And you just kind of work through all the, different tenants. But once you've identified that it's a hole for these tenants, it's usually 3 to 6 months before you get a human on site that looks at it and says, hey, I think I can get this approved corporately, internally, and we should move forward and do this deal.
Okay. So you win the site, and then you start kind of laying out some stuff, and you have a good idea of who you want as tenants there. When did you start construction, and how pre-leased were you for that?
Yeah. So on this 2-acre piece, we had both tenants pre-leased before we started our site work construction, and they both did ground leases. We ended up starting construction on our site work August of 2022, and we had closed in September of 2020. So 2 years later.
Did you get a loan to buy it, or did you just buy it all cash? How did you finance that?
We bought the land cash and figured we would have enough cash in it that we could borrow and go vertical, or we could borrow and do site work costs if we ended up with ground leases. We thought it was at least likely one of these would be a ground lease. We ended up with 2 ground leases versus.
What makes you think that something would be a ground lease versus a build to suit, or maybe the tenant would buy it themselves?
Almost purely instinct and just being a drive-through nerd, right? Because it's not you can't just look at, does it work for Del Taco or Taco Bell or Jack in the Box or Subway, whoever it is. You have to then know, how does this specific operator in this trade area do their deals? And are they going to want to do a ground lease versus build to suit? How well capitalized are they today? Do we actually want to do a build to suit for them? Or are we concerned about where they're at financially? So, there's a lot that goes into it, but a lot of just experience.
Yeah. Okay. So you said the 2 tenants did the ground leases. Which tenants were those?
We ended up with Jack in the Box on the pad closest to the Holiday Oil Chevron gas station. And then just south of them was Quick Quack.
Did you also do a multi-tenant retail building there?
Yes. So this is the first phase. And so about halfway through our project, if I kind of start walking through the site plan approval, it'll help arrive at how we ended up with the second phase. So we bid, and what's very customary when you bid on these UDOT properties, if there's any conditions of title that might impact the property to the negative, they're included. And what I mean by that is every property has an appraisal attached to it. And the appraiser's job is to appraise that property with the conditions that UDOT is delivering the title in. So for example, they take a lot of remnant pieces that are next to a highway or an interstate or state highway or something, and they don't ever have any intention of allowing access onto their road. And so what they will do is offer the property for sale, and it'll be subject to not having access there. So in other words, the buyer has to figure out some other access point or whatever, right? But it's on them to figure it out. Therefore, the appraiser then considers that as they're appraising the property and dings the value, obviously without prime access. So here, our access was on 5600, and you can see this in the slide here that we're providing. But the access says 5600 West, which is our one public right-of-way frontage, and then it says subject to permit. So we love the idea that we ended up with 2 ground lease pads, because we thought this is perfect. There's actually a street on the right side of 5600 West that if you basically drew a street, an ingress-egress point right in between the 2 pads on our property, it lines up almost perfectly with the street, the residential street that's on the east side. And that's a common thing that, most of the cities really like us to line those up as much as we can. So we were feeling really good. And so we made a submittal to UDOT, and we did that in September, the fall of 21. So about 1 year after we had bought the property and got the leases signed and got the site plan to a point where we could submit it to UDOT for access. And UDOT came back and said, hey, we're going to reject this. And, it was kind of interesting that they said that they were going to reject it. And this is, you're making that submittal, but it's not really a submittal. You're really kind of scheduling a red line meeting is what you're doing with them on your first round. And so they verbally told us, look, we're not going to give you access on 5600 West. And so this goes back and forth for a few months. And it's hard. There's a lot of people involved. You have engineers involved. And so finally, it just was until we finally got kind of the person, the right-of-way director for Region 2 on the phone and just said, what is the thought here, right? We just bought this property. It states clearly in the offering memorandum that we could have access onto this road subject to permit. And now you're telling us we cannot get a permit. You've sold us something that is not worth what we paid for it, right? This doesn't work. They just explain look, you just got to call UTA. They own the property to the south of you, and tell them you're going to work access through them. And it's okay, well, this is fun, right? Who's having fun?
Yep.
So, you're going from one government entity to another and saying, hi, UTA, we know you don't know us from anybody else on earth, but how are you? And by the way, UDOT told us that you're going to work with us on access. And they're like, we are? And you're like, this is great.
Apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically what happened, UDOT originally owned all this ground, including the UTA ground to the west of us. And they deeded the ground to UTA. UTA is planning to put a bus rapid transport line up 56 West. And so ultimately this, acreage behind us will be a park and ride for that rapid transit line. And UTA had a little dog leg that came out to 5600 West so that they then had an access point up to 54 South and over to 5600 West. And that jog came directly across the south side of our property. So we start down that path and we go down, and it takes us a while. UTA is fabulous to work with. Probably the best government entity that we've worked with in a long time. They were tremendous. And so what we ended up designing was an access drive that came along the south side of our property. And we actually designed it with heavy, heavy concrete. So it's much thicker concrete it's concrete drive aisle versus asphalt, which we often pour here in the mountains. But it's concrete and it's much bigger because it needs to handle the bus traffic coming in and out of there. Well, the moment we started designing that, we realized that the only other acreage here that was going to benefit from this drive aisle was the 2 acres to the south. So there was a very nice gentleman that owned that 2 acres to the south, and he is a operator of a Chinese restaurant located just south of these properties, kind of down by the Walmart. And he had previously tried to put in a restaurant and had hit some issues with UDOT from an access point standpoint, and where they didn't want to give him access directly on 56 West either, and he couldn't really figure out how to get to the next step. So he was frustrated. So what we did is we went back to him and we said, look, why don't you let us put it under contract? We'll pay we'll pay for your property and then we'll develop it out. And that was the plan we came up with and put him under contract. And so to answer your question, long-winded, that is where we ended up with a 4-tenant multi-tenant building and a Starbucks is on phase 2.
Okay. So phase 1 was the 2 ground leases. And then phase 2 was the multi-tenant drive-through. That one, you had quite a bit more time to design and that type of stuff, right? So is it kind of the same process as phase 1? Who's not in the area? Who wants to be in the area? And how much potential do we think this has as like a retail development? Is that kind of how you were thinking about it?
What's really nice about doing a phase 2 next to a phase 1 is you're logging all that tenant activity you had on phase 1 that you couldn't accommodate. So, we initially approached Starbucks about going on to one of the first 2 pads, but by the time that they warmed up on the property, we had already committed them to the other users. And so we kind of had them in our back pocket, which is what really kind of gave us the encouragement to go tie up these additional properties.
And then is it just back to the drawing board? Like, hey, Starbucks, sorry you missed out on the first one, but now we have the second one. Are you interested now?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. And were they a standalone pad or were they a part of that multi-tenant?
They ended up as a standalone. They would have done either. They would have been fine to go either. At the exact moment we pulled the trigger with them, it was more economical and it was more feasible to get a single tenant building delivered for them than it was a multi.
Okay. And what makes that make sense? Like why does that make sense for them?
For Starbucks? Well, it's really a cap rate valuation standpoint from us as developer, right? So
okay.
The cap rate attached to a multi-tenant building with Starbucks was not as good as a freestanding single-tenant cap.
What do you think the discrepancy is? Like 50 basis points or something? Or even more?
I mean, obviously the sales brokers could do a much better job answering that question for you, but probably somewhere between 50 and 100 basis points, depending on who your co-tenants are and everything else. One of the things Starbucks also insists on almost every multi-tenant scenario is having an early termination right. And so it's pretty normal that you see an early termination in those multi-tenant leases.
What gives them the right to do that?
They have 40,000 plus stores,
right.
And the operator.
I mean, like they can just say like, they don't have to say like, oh, our store count or our volume is too low, or we don't like the co-tenancy or anything. They can just like pick up and leave.
Yeah, you can work with them on the language and try to minimize it as much as you can. But at the end of the day, they are the 500-pound gorilla in the coffee world. So if you like them, you're going to make some compromises that you probably don't love as a landlord.
Yeah. Okay. So you put them in, and then are you starting the retail building at the same time, or is it phased differently as well?
No, we tried to do both at the same time. A lot of efficiencies there. So we did both. We actually moved our site work crew from the first phase. They were wrapping that up and immediately rolled over into the second phase right away. And of course, they built the drive aisle attached to the first phase. Because then once we had finished our ground lease obligations as landlord, we handed off the possession of the property to the 2 ground lease tenants, and then they constructed their buildings. And so we rolled right into the construction on the next phase and built both buildings at the same time.
And how did you finance those ones? You own the land in cash and then borrow against it with like a local bank, or how did that work?
So we do most of our bank debt for construction through regional and local banks. And this was no exception. We used SunWest Bank here.
Yep.
So
Okay.
on the first phase, we'd use Bank of Utah.
Did they require any pre-leasing, or were you all the way pre-leased on that retail building?
Yeah, we were 100% pre-leased at the time of construction.
Shout out Legend CRE for
Yeah.
getting that done for you. So,
Yeah.
Okay. And then as you're designing this, how early did you bring in the general contractor?
Very early. Really the kind of the first discussion points, feasibility, what kind of materials we're using, from the cladding on the exterior of the building to what is the construction methodology to fire sprinkler, everything. There's no reason to not get your contractors. Select them early. I always recommend if somebody's going to get into a repeat building business to get really comfortable with a couple of contractors that are kind of go-tos, and then bring them in early on the design side because you will save yourself a ton of money.
How do you choose those general contractors? Is it like referral based or just being in the industry for a while, or what makes you choose one over the other?
I think if you are brand new to it, what you probably want to do is look for a couple of national tenants like a Starbucks or one of the kind of the other prolific expanders that's moving a lot and opening a lot of stores. Dutch Bros could be another one. Find them and figure out who's building their buildings. And then go talk to them and see which contractor you get along with the best. And then hire them and go build a building with them. And then hire one of their competitors and build the next building with them and see who you like and who you got along better with. And everybody's got strengths and weaknesses. They got a hard job. Their job is trying to build these things. And the whole world has never recovered from supply chain problem from COVID. And they've got a terrible job. It's really intense for them.
You said you got the building pre-leased. How was that negotiation? Retail rents have climbed dramatically from like 2019, 2020 to what they are today. Did you just throw that out on the market and say, if you want it, you can get it, and if not, then sorry? Or how did those leasing negotiations go?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. We got hit with a double whammy on this building. And what I mean by that is cost increased from 21 to 22 quite a bit. And so we started negotiating with all of the tenants on the phase 2 property in 22. And then what happened is costs ran up again. And so between us agreeing to leases and then agreeing to us getting to construction estimating based off of plans, like bidding off of plans, it was really lousy because we had probably gone up another 15 or 18% year over year. The other half of that, but we were already under lease and we'd already made deals. And so it was, it is what it is. There's nothing we can do about it. The second half of that is that during that same time period, Jerome Powell was ruining all of our lives in commercial real estate, which everybody's well aware of.
Yep, I'm unfortunately aware.
Right. And so at the same time, we had rents locked, you have costs going up, and then you've got cap rates going up, which is causing values to come down. And so it really was just a perfect storm. So, by the time we got to construction start here, it didn't look horrendous. By the time we're ending with the project, there's some profit there. It's not as anywhere near what it should have been or could have been. And it's just unfortunate. And so what's interesting is the rents that we got in there, at the time we signed the leases, looked decently high. And now they just look normal, right? They don't look high anymore. And so, if we were quoting those same rents today, we'd be $10 a foot higher, probably across the board on every tenant.
And then if anybody wants to see the spreadsheet that you use for your development pro forma, we'll have a link in the description.
Yeah, absolutely. Write the show notes and feel free to reach out if there's anything we can help you with on that.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thank you.